Hello, I'm Dr. Deborah Campbell, and I am making these videos as companion videos to Patrick J. Hurley's Concise Introduction to Logic. This particular video goes along with Chapter 6, Propositional Logic, which hopefully you've been reading about, and 6.1 is the first section in Chapter 6. It's about symbols and translation. So I am not going to go deeply into what is propositional logic and all of that, because you can read about all of that. It's very straightforward. And there are easy bits, learning the symbols in translation, the 5 logical operators. I'm just going to go over that very briefly. What I'm going to focus on in this video is what I call the tricky bits. If you're a Monty Python fan, then you'll pick up on that little Monty Python reference. The tricky bits are certain problems in the exercise sets that I find the students have found they have the most questions about. So that's what this video is about. So just briefly, let me start with, remember, propositional logic, the fundamental element is a simple proposition or simple statement. Now, in the past, for all these years I've been teaching, I have used as simple, declarative, non-controversial statements, who is president and who is first lady. As I was writing them out this time, I realized for the first time, this might not be a clearly non-controversial statement, but I'm going to treat it as such. That Joe Biden is president, Jill Biden is first lady, Donald Trump is president, Hillary Clinton is president, and that we know whether those are true or false, okay? So I'm going to take it, understanding that Joe Biden is president is true, Jill Biden first lady is true, Donald Trump is president is false, and Hillary Clinton as president is false. Again, I never thought these claims would be controversial. I thought they were pretty simple and straightforward. But setting all of that aside, remember, we're not so concerned with truth or falsity. We're looking at the underlying symbolization of logical statements or statements that have logical operators so that we can later be able to symbolize the statements in an entire argument to check that argument for validity. That's where we're going in by the time we get to section 6.4 in chapter 6. So 6.1, the fundamentals. Hopefully you've been reading that if you take each one of these statements as a simple declarative statement, it needs one letter to represent it, and in our symbolic logic. So Joe Biden is president. Normally, you would take the first letter of the first noun or proper noun. And so you might select Joe for Joe Biden as president. But that would present a problem if we want to put that together with a compound like Jill Biden as first lady, because then we'd be selecting J again. Or even if we used B, they happen to have the same initials. So you can choose any letter of any noun or proper noun in the statement to represent it. Just remember, it has to represent the entire statement. And when you're symbolizing an entire argument, every distinct statement has to have its own distinct letter, so to lay out the underlying logic. So Joe Biden is president. Because I don't want to use J or B, I'll use P for president. He is currently president. Jill Biden is first lady. I'll just use F for first lady. Donald Trump is president. No other statement begins with D, so we can use D. And Hillary Clinton is president, we can use H. Again, just pick a word, noun or proper noun in the statement that will help you remember it, okay? Now, I do want to say one thing about, in section 1.4, you learned about the underlying symbolization for categorical logic, categorical syllogisms. And in those instances of categorical logic, which we're skipping over, that's chapter 4, and we're skipping over that. If we were symbolizing categorical arguments, in that case, the fundamental element is a subject or predicate term. So you have to put a letter for the subject term and a letter for the predicate, like Socrates is a man would be, S is M. Forget that. In propositional logic, the fundamental element is the simple statement. So a letter just for an entire simple statement. Okay, so this P doesn't stand for president. It stands for the entire claim, Joe Biden is president. Okay, that's kind of important to remember, because when we start to symbolize the compound statements, linking things together, you want to be clear about what is a logically simple statement and what's a logically compound statement. For example, as you learned the 5 logical operators, this is the tilde. We're not going to call it the squiggly line. It's a tilde. And it represents not from English. It represents the function of negation, negates whatever it's in front of. So a symbolized statement, for example, we could say, Donald Trump is not president. That's a logically compound statement. You can't use the letter D for that. D would be Donald Trump is president. To say he's not president is logically compound, and it would be symbolized not D. Okay? Another pretty straightforward symbolization is when you symbolize conjunctions or and. So this is the dot. It stands usually for the word and, but it can represent a whole lot of words we use to conjoin simple statements together, like and, but, yet, moreover, however, also, in addition to. There's a whole list in your book. So the dot just does not just represent and. I didn't write them out here just to save space, but be aware in your book that things like moreover, however, those are symbolized with the dot as well. Okay, and that represents the function of conjunction, putting any 2 statements together. So if we wanted to do a conjunction, it could be something like Joe Biden is president and Jill Biden is first lady, and that would just be a simple P dot F. If we were using an or, the wedge represents the logical function of disjunction or. This wedge, we're not going to call it the little v, it's a wedge, and it represents from English, or translates from English, the terms or, either or, and the word unless. So you use the wedge for or, either or unless, and this would be something like either Biden is president or Donald Trump is president. Okay, again, pretty simple and straightforward. For the moment, I'm going to skip over the horseshoe because that's one of the tricky bits. Typically, the horseshoe is laid out in a conditional statement, like if Biden is president, then Jill Biden is first lady, okay? And that would be a straightforward P horseshoe F, okay? But you may have already, if you're working on the exercise, you may have already noticed that this represents not only the traditional if-then, it represents if by itself, it also represents only if. And if introduces a sufficient condition, and only if introduces the necessary condition. You may remember from 1.2 that a conditional statement is broken up into the antecedent, the if part, or sufficient condition, and the consequent, the then part, and that contains the necessary condition. So if Joe Biden is president, that's sufficient for knowing that Jill Biden is first lady, okay? All right, more about that in just a minute. The if and only if, that one's fairly straightforward. It is only used to symbolize 2 expressions. The entire expression if and only if, and if you want to say something is both sufficient and necessary, okay? Because the if is the sufficient condition, and the then, or an only if, is the necessary condition. The sufficient condition, the if, always comes in front of the horseshoe, and the necessary condition, the then, always comes after the horseshoe. But it can, and it would look like this. So Joe Biden is president if and only if Jill Biden is first lady. Okay? Now here's where one of the tricky bits. And in exercise set 6.1, part 1, numbers 5 through 10 sometimes can cause a little consternation. So let me just show you, run through the examples. In your text, there are a whole set of these same examples. And so if you're working on the exercise sets and you find that you're getting confused about if and versus only if, just go back to the reading because they have examples of each one of these in there. I've written them out in just sort of a short version just to give you the run through the quick examples. So with if-then, in a traditional if-then, again, the P is the sufficient condition, the F is the necessary condition or the consequent, so it's traditionally P horseshoe F. That's pretty easy. But keep in mind, this horseshoe does not represent the word if or the word then. This horseshoe is an implication. It's to say if the sufficient condition is met, it implies the necessary condition. So literally, that horseshoe stands for the word implies. It's just used to symbolize if then, and only if much more often than people saying implies. Now, here's something that typically happens. Sometimes people, instead of putting it in the traditional if-then format, right, they will say something like this. Biden is president if Jill Biden is first lady. When you have an if by itself in the middle of a statement, you have to remember that if introduces the sufficient condition, so it has to be flipped around, right? Sufficient condition, the antecedent always comes before the horseshoe. So this would be symbolized like this, okay? So be aware of the difference between, I think it's numbers 5 and 6, about Chanel and Lancome. So remember that when if is by itself in the middle of a statement, you have to flip it around. That's really the only tricky thing, because if you have only if Joe Biden is president, only if Jill Biden is first lady, the only if introduces the necessary condition, so it stays in the same format, P horseshoe F. Okay? Also beware that sometimes you will have a statement that says something like, P is the case given that F, right? Joe Biden is president given that Jill Biden is first lady. Well, given that acts like an if. Provided that acts like an if. So this would also be switched around. Again, there are plenty of examples of this in your book. Okay? I just wanted to give you a little more explanation. The other tricky bits in this section are when you have logical operators not and both in the same statement. That can get a little tricky. So when you're symbolizing. Now, we don't traditionally say something like, it's not both Joe Biden is president and Donald Trump is president. Your book lays out those statements in a kind of artificial way that sounds a little strange, because they're trying to emphasize that when the not comes first, if you say it's not the case that both Joe Biden is president and Donald Trump is president, the not has priority. If you remember it that way, you'll never have any problem. This is going to be symbolized with the tilde, the not outside, and because it's negating the two together, not separately. Okay, that's different. So if I say it can't both be, however your not is represented, whether it's the word not or in a contraction like can't or won't, if you have a not that comes before the and, it's symbolized this way. And again, there's a whole set of examples in your book when they introduce this that you can refer back to when you're doing your exercise sets. Now, not both is different from both of them are not. If you say both are not, that's saying something different. And that would be symbolized like this. It would be true that both Hillary is not president and Donald Trump is not president. Now, you see the difference between saying both of these people are not president versus it's not the case that both Biden and Donald Trump are president. Do you see how each of these are true and they mean something very different? So not both versus both do not, you have to be careful about those. Easy way to remember it, if the not comes first in the statement, it's outside and negating the whole thing. If the not comes later, then it has to be split over them individually. It works the same way for not the case that either versus either one or the other is not, okay? So if it's not the case that either Hillary or Donald Trump, notice that the tilde is outside, but it's an either or. Now later on, when we get to chapter 7, you're going to learn that according to Augustus de Morgan, who first codified this, that to say that both of them are not is the same, logically, as saying it's not the case that either. But when you're symbolizing, symbolize it correctly, even though they logically have the same outcome. Okay, so these two are actually logically equivalent. And if I say either Biden or Donald is not president, then that's going to be either Biden is not or Donald Trump is not. That's when the tilde gets split, because we're saying either, and this is the main operator, this has priority, either Joe Biden is not or Donald Trump is not. And that's true because, you know, one of them is and one of them is not. Okay, so how do you put all of this together when you're symbolizing a longer expression, longer compound statement? So I chose number 26. I wrote it out here in a little bit of a shorthand just to save space. But number 26 in 6.1 exercise set 1, it was if either Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, I think it's floods the world with weapons of mass or weapons of war, then neither General Dynamics or Boeing reduces the likelihood of war. Okay, that seems overwhelming at first. But you want to approach these by breaking them down into smaller parts. And I always start by choosing the letters that I'm going to use for the simple statements. So I'm going to write the symbolization of this here. Notice the main structure. Look at your first word. You've got an if-then. The main structure of this statement is an if-then. So you know at some point you're going to need the logical operator horseshoe. All right, but let's put the letters in first. We're going to need a letter for Lockheed Martin floods the world. Okay. We're going to need a letter for Raytheon floods the world. We're going to need a letter for General Dynamic. And we're going to need a letter for Boeing reduces. Okay? So those are going to be your fundamental letters that stand for the fundamental statements that make up this compound, long compound statement. Now we have to worry about what's the logical relationship. What did the statement actually say? Well, we know the main operator is if this, then that. So we need a horseshoe. And because these are compound expressions, we're going to need parentheses. But let's make sure we put the parentheses in the right place. This is either Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. So we're going to need L wedge R. And that's the entire antecedent, or if, part of the statement. Then neither General Dynamic or Boeing. Now, neither is just a contraction for the logical not either. Neither is just a contraction for not either. So we would need this symbolization. So neither General Dynamics. So it's going to be not either or. Okay? Hopefully that gives you an example of how to approach the long compound statements and some of what I call the tricky bits, the one that students usually have most questions about. All right, well, I hope that was helpful. Thanks for listening.